The wedding photo appeared on Naomi Carter's phone screen at the exact moment she hit send on the biggest proposal of the quarter. The man smiling beneath a white floral arch in that picture was her husband, Adrian Wells, the same man who had kissed her goodbye at the airport 3 days earlier and said he had to fly to Toronto to close an important deal. In that instant, every sound inside the high-rise office overlooking downtown Chicago seemed to vanish. The printer humming at the end of the hallway disappeared. Even the low drone of the air conditioning dissolved into nothing. All that remained was the cold blue glow from her phone screen, spilling across Naomi's face, making her skin look paler, her eyes darker, and the silence around her so unnerving that even the colleague sitting several desks away suddenly looked up. Naomi did not blink. In the photo, Adrian was wearing a perfectly tailored ivory tuxedo. His face was radiant, lit up by a kind of happiness Naomi had not seen on her husband in a very long time. Beside him stood Sienna Hart, the young woman from Brand Partnerships, the one who had nodded politely to Naomi a few times in the company lobby, with a sweetness so subdued it nearly disappeared. Sienna wore a silk wedding dress that hugged her frame, one hand resting on an ivory bouquet, the other looped around Adrian's arm, as if that place had always belonged to her. But the deepest knife was not the dress, and it was not Adrian's smile. It was the woman standing on the right side of the frame, Lorraine Wells. Naomi's mother-in-law was dressed in dark blue, a strand of pearls around her neck, one hand resting proudly on her son's shoulder. She was smiling with a kind of pure satisfaction, the kind that only appears when someone is certain they have finally put everything back in the order they wanted. Beneath the photo was a short caption, neat and simple, but sharp enough to crush 5 years of marriage in a single heartbeat. At last, my son married the right woman. Naomi read it once, then again. The comments below swarmed upward like black ants. Congratulations to the Wells family for finally getting a daughter-in-law who knows how to care for a home. Sienna already looks more blessed. Can't wait to hear baby news. No one wrote as if it were a joke. No one sounded surprised. No one asked where Naomi was. That meant everyone in that photo, and everyone leaving those cheerful comments, knew. They had known beforehand. They had watched everything unfold. They had waited for this day. And now they were celebrating as if Naomi had never existed. Her hand holding the phone went cold. She had been working non-stop since early morning. She had just finalized a major rebranding proposal for a luxury boutique hotel chain on the East Coast, a proposal that, if successful, would bring the group a massive profit. She had spent the entire day surviving on coffee, a few bites of wilted salad, endless emails, budget revisions, and color corrections in a presentation deck. Her head had been pounding from exhaustion, but now that pain meant nothing. To everyone around her, Naomi had always been composed. She rarely raised her voice. She disliked showmanship. She let Adrian appear in public as the polished husband, the accomplished operations executive, the man with standing and influence. Most people looked at them and assumed Adrian was the center, while Naomi was simply the kind of woman who made good money, loved too softly, and stayed too busy to notice what was happening inside her own marriage. They had read her wrong. But at that moment, no one knew it yet. Naomi slowly zoomed in on the image. The wedding arch had been set up at an elegant vineyard on the outskirts of the city. The tables in the background were draped in white linen, glass candles reflecting the deep gold of the late afternoon light. Her sister-in-law was there. Adrian's 2 uncles were there. A close friend who had dined at Naomi's lakefront estate less than 2 weeks ago was there too. Familiar faces. All of them people who had sat inside her home, drinking from crystal glasses she had bought, laughing under warm lights that were paid for by her electricity bills, her maintenance costs, her mortgage payments, and the quiet labor that sustained every polished inch of that lavish house. Naomi remembered the message she had sent Adrian that morning. Did the trip go smoothly, love? Make sure you eat dinner. I'll wait to hear from you. Beside it were only the delivered marks. No reply. And suddenly she found it almost funny. A cold kind of funny that cut all the way to the bone. While she had been draining herself dry for a multi-million-dollar contract, Adrian had been standing under the evening sun, reciting vows to another woman. While she believed her husband was flying to Toronto for work, he had been raising a glass to celebrate his secret wedding. At the far end of the workspace, Skylar, the young assistant from the creative support team, glanced over at Naomi again. She could not see the phone screen, but she could feel that something was terribly wrong. Naomi had been sitting too still for too long. So still it felt unnatural. Still like a lake frozen solid in the middle of summer. Naomi placed the phone down on the desk, then picked it up again. She opened her old messages with Adrian and scrolled upward, reading through the short exchanges from the past few months, as if she were reviewing the file of a stranger. The replies that had grown increasingly shallow, the business trips that had multiplied, the postponed promises, the canceled dinners, the absent-minded hugs, the late nights that came home carrying another woman's perfume. Each one had once seemed like a small shard of glass. Now they had fitted together into a complete mirror, revealing the true face of the man she had married. She did not cry. Naomi noticed that herself. Not a single tear fell. Her heart did not explode the way people said it should in stories like this. It froze. Quietly. Hardly. Dangerously. Somewhere else, several hours away by plane, Adrian was looking at his own phone. He saw Naomi's last message from that morning, but he did not bother to reply. In his mind, Naomi was still the wife who would wait, who would be hurt, who would cry, and who would eventually accept whatever explanation he offered. Lorraine thought the same thing. She had always seen Naomi as the kind of woman who was strong in business, but weak in love. The kind of woman who, once cornered, would retreat into herself just to keep everything from collapsing. Sienna was different. She felt a flicker of unease. Even wrapped in an expensive wedding gown, even while soaking in sweet congratulations, some small corner of her heart understood that the woman being betrayed was not ordinary. She had seen Naomi walk through the company lobby in a pearl-toned suit, never loud, never showy. Yet every conversation around her seemed to lower itself the moment she passed. Some kinds of power do not need to announce themselves. Naomi had exactly that kind of power. Still, Sienna reassured herself. No matter how capable a woman was, once her husband betrayed her, she was just a bleeding heart. She had no idea how wrong she was. Naomi stood. The movement pushed her chair back with a soft roll. Skylar immediately stepped closer, her voice cautious. "Naomi, are you okay?" Naomi turned to look at the young woman. There were no tears in her eyes, only a gleam as cold as steel pulled from ice water. "I'm fine," she said, her voice disturbingly calm. "You should head home." Skylar hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded. She had no idea what had just happened, but instinct told her that the woman standing in front of her had crossed some invisible threshold. This was no longer fatigue. No longer sadness. It was a decision. Naomi shut down her computer, slipped her laptop into her bag, picked up her phone, her car keys, and the small leather notebook that always stayed in her private drawer. She did not take much. A woman leaving for revenge did not need bulky luggage. A woman reclaiming her life only needed clarity. She walked down the glass corridor of the office floor. Outside, Chicago was sinking into the deep bronze color of sunset. The buildings caught the fading light like upright blades. Naomi moved past them, as if she were walking through an old world that was quietly sealing itself shut behind her. Inside the elevator, on the way down, she opened the wedding photo one last time. Adrian was smiling. Lorraine was smiling. Sienna was smiling. Naomi stared at the picture for a long moment, then locked the screen. Their smiles would not last much longer, because there was one thing Adrian, Lorraine, and Sienna did not know. The woman they had all so confidently underestimated was not just the one who paid for the lakefront estate they loved to show off. Naomi Carter held the real keys. The keys to the assets. The keys to the company. The keys to the truth. And tonight, she would begin opening every door, one by one. The first door opened right there in the underground parking garage, where white light spilled across the cold concrete floor like the glow of an operating room. Naomi Carter sat behind the wheel, but did not start the engine. Both hands still rested on her phone. The screen had gone dark, but the wedding photo still seemed burned into her retinas, flaring every time she blinked. She did not want to guess anymore. Guessing was for people who still had hope. Naomi had none left. She needed the truth. Bare, cruel, impossible to deny. Her finger slid through her contacts and stopped on the name Lorraine Wells. For one brief second, Naomi remembered all the years she had saved that woman's number, under a title softened by affection. All the birthday gifts she had sent, all the medical bills she had paid, all the expenses she had quietly covered that Adrian had never been generous enough to shoulder. She had once believed that respecting her mother-in-law was part of preserving a home. Now she understood. Some people do not see kindness as love. They see it as a resource. Naomi pressed call. The ringing stretched through the sealed silence of the car, making the air feel tighter with each second. Once, twice, 3 times. It was not until the 4th ring that the call connected. Lorraine's voice came through bright and strangely cheerful, as if she were still standing in the middle of a celebration that had not yet ended. "Naomi, dear, you're still not home at this hour. Still working?" Naomi heard the faint clink of glasses somewhere behind her, a distant burst of laughter, muffled music. So they were still celebrating. She asked, her voice so calm it sounded unfamiliar even to herself. "Where are you?" Lorraine paused for just a beat, but it was long enough for Naomi to know she understood. The hiding was over. And the moment Lorraine realized that, she did not sound ashamed. On the contrary, something almost pleasant seemed to rise inside her. She had never liked Naomi. Too cold, too intelligent, too accomplished. A daughter-in-law who could make money but would not bow to her mother-in-law's authority had never, in Lorraine's eyes, been the right kind of wife. Where she sat now, under the warm yellow lights of a resort outside the city, Lorraine set down her wine glass and curved her lips into a smile. "So you saw it?" Naomi did not answer right away. Inside her, every piece was clicking into place at an icy speed. No apology, no hesitation, no attempt to deny, just an acknowledgement, as casual as if they were discussing the weather. "Saw what?" A thin little laugh slipped through the line. "The wedding photo, obviously. I thought you were so busy you didn't even have time for social media." A cold current ran down Naomi's spine, but her voice remained flat. "So it's true. Did you think it was a joke?" That was the final answer to everything that had still been blurred around the edges. It was not a misunderstanding, not a staged photo shoot, not some impulsive little drama. They had held a wedding. They had taken pictures. They had shared it openly with family. And now her mother-in-law was confirming it all in the smug tone of someone who believed she had won. Naomi leaned her head back against the leather seat. She looked up at the roof of the car as if she needed something fixed and solid above her to keep her anger from exploding too soon. Why? Lorraine let out a dry little laugh. You still have to ask? Because you were never the wife Adrian needed. The sentence landed with terrifying precision. Naomi did not cut in. She let the woman keep talking. Some people, once they are convinced they are standing on the winning side, will tell you everything. Lorraine leaned back in her chair and glanced towards Sienna, who was sitting a short distance away. The new bride held her bouquet in her lap, lips pressed together. She was no longer smiling the way she had been for the photographs. She was still young, still beautiful, but there was now a thin streak of fear in her expression. She knew Naomi was not the kind of woman who would simply collapse and disappear. That knowledge unsettled her, even if it did not unsettle Lorraine. Lorraine went on, her tone sharpening. 5 years, Naomi. 5 years, and you still couldn't give this family a child. Adrian is the only son in the Wells family. He needs an heir. He needs a woman who knows how to put family before work. Not someone who lives at the office, flies out to meetings, and treats marriage like another item on her calendar. Naomi closed her eyes for 1 second. She had heard versions of those words for years. The barbed questions at dinner. The heavy sighs during the holidays. The advice wrapped in concern. But this was the first time Lorraine had spoken so plainly, with all of her contempt stripped bare. Naomi opened her eyes again. Did it ever occur to you that Adrian was the one who refused to get tested? Lorraine went silent for a brief beat. Then she brushed it away. Men are busy. That's normal. It's the woman who has to hold the family together. And besides, none of that matters now. Sienna is pregnant. Inside the car, time seemed to stop. Naomi did not move. But the hand resting on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles went white. Not because she was completely shocked. Some part of her had already guessed from the triumphant tone in the comments under the photo. But hearing Lorraine say it aloud still felt colder than anything she had imagined. How far along? 2 months? And at least that child will be born into a real family. Naomi laughed. A very small laugh, not joyful, not trembling. That sound made Lorraine falter for the first time. She had expected sobbing, or pleading, or at the very least the sound of a woman's pride shattering. Instead, there was only a silence as cold as ice on the line. Naomi asked again. So you knew from the beginning? Not knew, arranged. Lorraine said it with open pride. In her own mind, this was an accomplishment. The right decision of a mother who knew how to protect her son's future. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw Naomi as the obstacle that had outlived its usefulness. I introduced Sienna to Adrian. I told him not to waste his life on a woman who only knows how to make money and not how to bear children. I told him to think about the future. That girl is sweeter than you, more obedient. She knows how to let a man have his place. And now she's going to give this family a grandchild. Each word cut like a blade. Yet the more Naomi listened, the clearer she became. The pain was not fading. It was crystallizing, hardening into something sharp. She looked through the windshield. The parking garage was nearly empty. Another car rolled up the ramp and disappeared, its taillights smearing red through the dark like 2 streaks of blood. Naomi asked her final question, very softly. What do you think I'm going to do now? Lorraine did not answer right away. In her mind, Naomi was still just a wife backed into a corner, the kind of woman who, no matter how strong she seemed, would always fear losing her title, her reputation, her place. Lorraine took another sip of wine and let victory soften her voice with self-satisfaction. You should be smart. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin everything now that it's already done. If you behave, if you know your place, no one is stopping you from continuing to live comfortably. Adrian is a man. So what if there's another woman? The house is still there. Your life is still there. Just don't stand in the way of his happiness. At that same moment, on the other side of the resort, Sienna turned to look toward Lorraine. She could not hear every word of the conversation, but she guessed who was on the other end of the line. A strange unease rose inside her. She had always assumed that after today, Naomi would simply fade into a quiet shadow in some forgotten corner of Adrian's life. But what if Naomi did not stay quiet? What if she knew more than they thought? As for Adrian, a few tables away, surrounded by friends forcing drinks into his hand, he knew nothing. He laughed, drained his glass, accepted congratulations, completely unaware that back in Chicago, the very ground beneath him had already started to crack. Naomi spoke again, cutting through the thoughts of all of them. No, nothing is the way you think anymore. Lorraine frowned. What are you planning to do? Naomi lowered her eyes to the phone screen. The wedding photo was still there. Adrian's smile, Sienna's hand curled around his arm, the satisfaction on Lorraine's face. A new family built on betrayal, greed, and the belief that she would not dare fight back. She spoke slowly, one word at a time. I'm going to open every door all of you have worked so hard to keep shut. A chill suddenly moved through Lorraine, though the room around her was warm. In that instant, she understood something too late. Naomi was not crying. She was not begging. She was not even asking where Adrian was or demanding an explanation. That reaction was more frightening than any scream. Still, Lorraine forced steel back into her voice. Don't be foolish. You can't do anything. Naomi looked straight into the darkness ahead. When she spoke, her voice was very light enough to sound less like a threat and more like a verdict. You're wrong. The only person in this story who never understood what he was standing on is Adrian. Then she ended the call. No goodbye, no wasted word. Silence rushed back into the underground garage, heavier than before. Naomi set the phone down on the passenger seat. Her heart was beating slow, heavy, steady. The pain was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a wound that bled. It had become fuel. She opened her contacts again. This time her finger stopped on the name Claire Donovan. The moment the call connected, Naomi spoke without a single wasted word. Claire, I need your help tonight. I want the Winnetka estate sold, as fast as possible, and I want divorce papers prepared. On the other end, Claire was silent for exactly one beat. Not because she was fully surprised. A good lawyer always knows when a client's voice has crossed the point of no return. Then she asked, very briefly, What happened? Naomi leaned back against the seat. Outside the windshield, the darkness wrapped around the city. She looked straight ahead, at the garage exit rising like a tunnel into another life. My husband just married his mistress, and they think I'm going to quietly keep paying for their happiness. Claire's voice lowered. I understand. Meet me in 30 minutes. Naomi ended the call and at last started the engine. It rumbled to life, low and solid, like a declaration. The car eased out of its parking spot and rolled toward the ramp leading up to the surface. Above her, Chicago had already lit up, and beneath those lights a marriage had just died in silence. But at the same time, another woman had been born from its ashes. No longer the Naomi of strained dinners, No longer the Naomi who quietly paid for the comfort of an ungrateful family. As her car pulled out onto the main road, her reflection slipped across the dark window like the flash of a thin blade. Tonight, Adrian was still raising his glass in celebration. He did not know the lakefront house was already on its way to belonging to someone else. He did not know his cards were about to become useless pieces of plastic. He did not know the woman he had betrayed was not the kind who fell apart. And he certainly did not know that from this moment on, Naomi Carter would no longer ask anyone for the truth. She would take it herself. Naomi Carter did not drive like a woman who had just discovered her husband had married his mistress. She drove like someone plunging into the dark to reclaim what was hers before anyone else could strip it away. Red lights, amber lights, streaks of color bleeding across the wet pavement and flashing through the windshield. All of it slid across her face like thin blades. Chicago remained loud and alive, as if no life inside it had just been split clean in two. On the other side of the city, the lights were still on in Claire Donovan's office. Claire was the kind of woman who made people believe in the law at first glance. Her hair was twisted into a neat knot, her charcoal jacket perfectly sharp, her eyes keen and steady, with no room for useless panic. When Naomi stepped inside, Claire looked at her once and rose to her feet. No embrace, no sympathy, no polite questions. You do not comfort a woman who is burning from the inside out. You hand her a map of the war. Naomi set her phone down on the table. The wedding photo was still glowing on the screen. Claire glanced at it. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It's real. Naomi nodded. His mother confirmed it. Claire pulled out a chair for Naomi, then sat down across from her, opened her laptop, opened a notebook, opened a blank file. Her voice was low and precise. I need the truth in order. Which assets are solely in your name? Which assets are directly tied to Adrian? Which accounts are joint? Which companies he has access to? The affair and the secret wedding can wait until later. Naomi drew in a deep breath. Strangely, the moment she began speaking in the language of assets, ownership, and documentation, her heartbeat slowed. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a shapeless storm. It had become an axis. The estate in Winnetka is in my name. I bought it with a special bonus after the Northeast hotel chain restructuring deal. Current estimate is around $12.8 million. Claire looked up. Not because she was surprised by the value of the property, but because of Naomi's composure. A woman who had just been betrayed was discussing assets as if she were reading a quarterly report. That only happens when pain has moved beyond tears. Vehicles. My daily sedan is in my name. The family SUV, too. The coupe Adrian drives is not under his personal name. It belongs to the subsidiary. Claire stopped writing. Which subsidiary? Northcrest Hospitality Projects. Claire's expression shifted. She had worked with Naomi long enough to understand exactly what that meant. Adrian had always been the visible face of operations at Northcrest. Most people assumed he had built it, or at the very least held the real power there. And the shares. Naomi looked straight at Claire. I own the controlling stake. Adrian only has an executive contract and the right to use the title. I put him out front because, at the time, I thought a man might find it easier to live with himself if he was not constantly reminded that his success had been built in his wife's shadow. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. Even she felt the icy reversal of it all in that moment. Adrian thought he had been betraying a busy wife, soft and inattentive in her private life. He had no idea he had betrayed the woman holding the entire material foundation beneath his feet. How much is in the joint account? Around $140,000. I transfer household money into it at the beginning of each month. Adrian has supplementary cards under my main credit line. His mother used to have access to one for certain fixed expenses. Claire nodded, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. Good. We do this in order. First, cut the money flow. Second, isolate the assets. Third, prepare the divorce with an absolute documentary advantage. As for the estate, I can call Julian Mercer right now. He's been after that house for years. Naomi did not ask another question. Call him. Claire picked up the phone. Over the next few minutes, the world of people with money and a clear understanding of the value of silence began to move. Her call with Julian was short, crisp, without a drop of wasted emotion. He still wanted the property. If the paperwork was clean, he was ready to meet first thing in the morning. He liked clean, efficient deals. And that was exactly what Naomi needed. When Claire ended the call, the room fell silent for a few seconds. Outside the glass, the city skyline burned like a row of steel teeth. You are not going back to that house tonight, Claire said. If Adrian gets there first, if his family shows up, or if any dispute starts, you will get dragged into a performance you do not need. I have to go back once, Naomi replied. The original documents are still in the safe in my office. Claire studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Fine. But first, check into a hotel. Use your maiden name. I do not want him finding out where you are. Naomi did not argue. She was far too clear-minded to mistake pride for strategy. An hour later, she was standing in the lobby of a hotel with a black leather bag in her hand and a face so composed that the young receptionist simply assumed she was a female executive checking in after a long workday. Naomi signed under her old surname. The suite on the upper floor opened into the scent of clean wood, crisp sheets, and the sterile hush of places untouched by memory. She set down her bag, washed her face in cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror. The face staring back was still beautiful, but it was no longer soft. There was no time for collapse. She returned to her car. The road out to Winnetka was quieter than downtown. The houses thinned out. Tree shadows stretched long across the dark, whined off the lake, slipped through the empty spaces, like the breath of some giant animal lying in wait. When the estate came into view behind its iron gates, Naomi's heart did not twist the way she thought it might. It only went still. It was the feeling of looking at a beautiful body long after the soul had left it. She opened the door with her own key. Inside was darkness. The large house received her with the smell of polished wood, aging lilies in a crystal vase, and the elegant silence of a place that had witnessed too much deceit without ever learning how to speak. Naomi did not turn on all the lights. She left only the hallway sconces glowing softly, just enough to guide her. The sound of her heels tapping against the stone floor echoed faintly, like a countdown. Her office was at the end of the western corridor. That room had always been Naomi's true territory, even though Adrian liked to stand in the center of the main living room entertaining guests, as if the whole house revolved around him. Naomi stepped inside, slid an abstract painting aside, and revealed the hidden door of the wall safe. The code was no longer their wedding date. She had changed it months ago, after one of Adrian's half-joking comments that perhaps someday he might need the house documents as collateral for a project. At the time, Naomi had smiled. That same night she changed the code. The safe opened with a soft click. Naomi began removing the files one by one. The title deed to the estate, the vehicle documents, certificates for her personal investments, records of her controlling stake in Northcrest, old authorization agreements, cloud archive scans. Everything had been arranged neatly for years, a quiet order Adrian had never once cared enough to understand. At the back of the stack sat an old cream envelope. Naomi paused the moment she recognized the handwriting. Her father's. The note was short, just a few lines, tucked into the house file from the day the purchase had closed. Perhaps he had thought his daughter might one day need to read it again. My darling girl, if a home was built with your money, your mind, and your sleepless nights, never let anyone make you believe you are merely a guest inside it. Real love does not fear clarity. Only greed does. Naomi stood still for a very long time. For the first time that night, her eyes burned. But what rose inside her was not weakness. It was a sorrow so deep and clean, it felt like waves breaking against stone in the dark. Her father had seen long ago what she had only just touched with her own hands. Adrian was not extraordinarily clever. Naomi had simply loved with a trust too generous for its own good. She folded the letter and slipped it into a separate pocket. As she reached for the last file, she noticed a dark blue folder tucked deep inside the safe. It was not a color she used. There was no label, no classification tab, nothing to identify it. It lay hidden behind documents she knew with absolute certainty she had not placed there. Naomi stopped. A feeling, small but freezing, crept down her spine. She slowly pulled the folder out. Hardcover. New. The corners still sharp. Someone had put it there recently. The house remained silent. Beyond the tall windows, the wind off Lake Michigan moved through the trees with a rustling sound, as if someone were standing somewhere out in the dark, holding their breath, waiting for her to open whatever was inside. Naomi set the folder on the desk. Then, slowly, she opened it. Inside, it was not investment paperwork, nor any purchase agreement Naomi had ever stored. It was an insurance file, stacked with unnerving precision, the edges of the pages still sharp and new, as if it had only recently been placed in the safe. On the very first page, Naomi Carter's name appeared clearly under the field marked Insured Party. She did not sit down right away. For a few brief seconds, Naomi simply stood beside the desk, one hand resting on the cold wood, her eyes fixed on the bold print in the center of the page. Supplemental Accident and Life Insurance Policy. Payout value, $8 million. The air in the room changed instantly. If the pain Naomi had felt in the last chapter was the pain of a betrayed wife, then something else entered the room now. Something colder, heavier, far more dangerous. She turned to the next page so slowly that every soft rustle of paper sounded as sharp as a blade slicing through cloth. The issue date was 3 months ago. Naomi read it again. 3 months. That was exactly when Adrian's trips had become more frequent. His last-minute meetings more frequent, his excuses more frequent. And if Lorraine had told the truth, it was also the point when Sienna knew for certain that the child in her womb was enough to buy her an official place in the Wells family. Naomi turned to the beneficiary section. She did not blink, but her heartbeat changed. Sienna Hart. The relationship note was written in dry legal language, yet it was so grotesquely vague it made her stomach turn. Future beneficiary by marital family relation of spouse. A carefully twisted phrase, indirect enough to legalize what could not be named openly, yet clear enough that anyone with eyes would understand it. Sienna, not Adrian, not his mother, not a trust. Sienna. Naomi lowered the file very slowly. Her arm suddenly felt heavy, as if stone had been tied to it. She stared into the empty air in front of her, though she was not really seeing anything at all. Inside her mind, a thin line had just been pulled tight, stretching from the past into the present with the most terrifying kind of logic. That late-night drive nearly 2 months ago, when the brakes on her SUV had suddenly started making that strange grinding sound. The time Adrian had insisted on taking her car in for service himself, then brought it back wearing that calm smile, saying it was nothing serious. The week the outdoor security cameras had been disconnected because he said they needed a private upgrade to prevent a data breach. The other evening, when Naomi had grown dizzy after drinking the glass of wine Adrian poured for her, and had assumed she was simply exhausted. Each incident, at the time, had seemed too small to matter, easy to dismiss. But now, beneath the pale gold light in the silent room, they surfaced like slicks of oil spreading across dark water, repulsive, slippery, impossible to ignore, and clearly not accidents. She refused to let herself leap blindly to a conclusion. Naomi had never been the kind of woman who drowned herself in panic, but neither was she foolish enough to pretend this was all harmless coincidence. A man secretly marries his mistress. A mother-in-law openly supports the marriage. The mistress is pregnant and is named beneficiary on a multi-million-dollar insurance policy tied to the legal wife. Taken separately, each fact might still blur at the edges. Put together, they formed the shape of a trap. Somewhere far away, Adrian was still smiling. He had no idea that while he raised a glass in a luxury resort, Naomi was standing in her private office holding a document that could turn this filthy affair into something far more serious. In Adrian's mind, Naomi was probably crying herself empty by now, or driving aimlessly through the city, or calling him again and again. He had never truly understood the woman he married. He had only ever understood the gentler version of Naomi she had allowed him to see. And Sienna, the woman who had been called a bride only a few hours earlier, was now sitting alone in front of a mirror in her suite. She had changed out of her wedding dress, but her makeup was still perfectly intact. As her hand drifted to her stomach, she imagined the future. Bright rooms, elegant living, a life finally stepping fully out of the shadows of being the other woman. Yet there was a small black dot inside her heart. Sienna had not forgotten Naomi's eyes each time she crossed the company lobby. They were not the eyes of a woman who could be easily broken, certainly not the eyes of someone who would quietly step aside. As for Lorraine, after several glasses of wine, she was smugly telling a cousin that at last everything had fallen into place. In Lorraine's world, no matter how successful Naomi was, she was still just a woman who could not bear children. She believed women like Naomi always lost in the end, to family, to social judgment, to the terror of being alone. That very belief would destroy Lorraine before justice ever had the chance to touch her. Naomi pulled out her chair and sat down. She took out her phone, photographed every page of the file, saved multiple copies, then immediately sent them to her encrypted private email. After that, she called Claire. The line connected almost instantly. "I was waiting to hear from you," Claire said. "Are you still in the house?" Naomi looked down at the insurance file, and her voice dropped lower than before. "I found something else." A very brief silence followed. "What?" "An insurance policy in my name. Payout value is $8 million. The beneficiary is Sienna." Claire did not respond right away. Naomi could picture her face freezing behind her desk, her cool, precise eyes racing through every possibility. Claire lived by structure, by clauses, by evidence, but even for someone who had spent years staring at the ugliest corners of human nature through divorce papers and dispute files, this discovery was enough to chill the blood. "Are you sure it's legitimate? It looks completely official. Policy number, electronic signature, issue date? I'm sending you the photos now." Claire received the files. Naomi could hear the rapid clicking of keys in the background. "Do not jump to conclusions too soon," Claire said after a few seconds. "But this is no longer just adultery. Even if it does not ultimately rise to a full criminal conspiracy, it is still very important evidence of abnormal motive and attempted gain. You need to protect the original document carefully. Naomi lifted her eyes toward the tall office window. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan brushed against the glass like fingernails dragging softly across a surface. The house was suddenly too large, too empty of human warmth. Everything remained exactly where it had always been. Adrian's chair, their wedding photo on the shelf, the vase of flowers she had changed at the start of the week. Everything looked calm, with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate, as if even the walls had conspired to hide the truth. "I'm not staying here," Naomi said. "Good. Take every original document you need. Leave the rest for later. Don't stay alone in that house any longer than necessary." Naomi almost smiled, not because she felt any joy, but because she understood Claire had seen the same things she had. The danger was no longer emotional. It lay in what other people had calculated about her life and her assets. She began gathering her things quickly: her work laptop, the encrypted hard drive, property records, vehicle documents, share certificates, her father's letter, the insurance file. Then a few simple changes of clothes from the dressing room nearby. She did not move through the house like a wife leaving in tears. Naomi moved with precision, with purpose, wasting almost no motion at all. That did not mean she was not hurting. It only meant her pain no longer had the right to command her. Before she left the office, her gaze landed on the framed wedding photo sitting on the side table. In it, Adrian had his arm around her waist, his face handsome, confident, almost too perfect in the way that makes people want to trust too easily. The Naomi in that photograph stood beside him, with bright, gentle eyes, believing she had chosen the right man. For one sharp moment, something cracked deep inside her. Not because she still longed for him, but because she felt sorrow for the woman in that picture, the woman who had loved with her whole trust and never knew what kind of man she was giving it to. Naomi picked up the frame. She slid the photo out from behind the glass. Her hands did not shake. Once, then again. She tore the picture cleanly in two. Her face separated from Adrian's. Then she tore it again. And again, until all that remained in her hands were soft, crumpled scraps of paper. Naomi dropped them into the wastebasket beside the desk, not as revenge, as a burial. When she stepped into the hallway for the last time, she turned off the office light and locked the door. The click of the lock was soft but decisive, like a ritual closing over the past. She walked through the large living room, past the kitchen where she had so many times cooked Adrian's favorite meals after 10 exhausting hours of work, past the curved staircase where Lorraine had once stood looking down and making veiled comments about grandchildren. With every step away from the house, she felt a little lighter. Outside, the wind off the lake was brutally cold, whipping at the edge of Naomi's coat. She placed her bags in the car, then turned back for one final look at the estate. The facade was still beautiful. The windows still glowed softly under the security lights. No one passing by would ever guess that inside, a marriage had just died, a belief had just died, and perhaps even the sense of safety a woman once thought she possessed had died with them. Naomi slid behind the wheel and closed the door, letting darkness wrap around her for a moment. Her phone vibrated. A message from Claire lit up the screen. "I did a preliminary check on the policy number. It exists. We'll talk when you get back to the hotel." Naomi, from this moment on, stop thinking of this as only a divorce. Think of it as a strategic withdrawal from a dangerous zone. Naomi stared at the message for a long time. Then she started the engine. The car rolled away from the entrance of the estate, her headlights splitting the darkness in two. In the rearview mirror, the house slowly receded, growing smaller, farther away, like a luxurious stage that had just closed its curtain. after the most grotesque performance of her life. Naomi did not look back again, because she understood something very clearly now. From this point on, she was no longer a betrayed wife searching for an explanation. She was a woman trying to save her own life. And tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the lake, the first strike of her counterattack would begin. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, Naomi Carter had already been awake for hours. She had barely slept. Not because she was afraid. Not entirely because she was hurting either. It was because her mind had worked through the night like a machine switched into survival mode. In the silent hotel suite, Naomi sat beside the wide window and watched the Chicago skyline shift from cold gray to pale silver, then to a thin wash of gold. The city was beginning its day, as if everything were normal. Only she knew this was not a normal morning. This was the morning she would begin dismantling the false life other people had built with her money, her trust, and the contempt they had for her. On the table beside the bed, the insurance file lay curled in on itself like a snake. Naomi looked at it once, then turned away. She would not let fear throw off her hand now. Fear would have its place later. This morning belonged to strategy. She stood, chose a sharply tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white blouse, small pearl earrings, and pinned her hair into a low knot. The woman in the mirror did not look like someone who had just learned her husband had married his mistress. She looked like an executive preparing to walk into the biggest deal of her life. And in a bitter way, that was exactly what this was. By the time Naomi arrived at Claire Donovan's office, it was only a little past 9. Claire was already waiting with 2 black coffees and a folder divided by color-coded tabs. Inside the glass-walled conference room, Julian Mercer was there too. He was the kind of man whose coldness only became more expensive with age. Ash-gray suit, folded pocket square, and the eyes of an investor who looked at real estate the way other people looked at profitable chess pieces. He rose when Naomi entered. "I'm sorry you have to sell the house under these circumstances," he said. "But I'm not someone who wastes time. If you want this done today, I'll get it done today." Naomi sat, setting her file bag on the table. "I want it finished before the day is over." Julian nodded. He liked that answer. Claire no longer looked at Naomi. She simply opened one packet after another, pointed out every line that needed signing, every clause that needed review. Her voice was even and solid, like stakes being driven into shaking ground. The Winnetka estate had been revalued overnight, and Julian's final number came in close to the figure he had offered before. No one dragged out the negotiation. No one played games. In that sunlit conference room, a house that had once symbolized Naomi's marriage was being reduced to what it had always been in her hands: an asset. Naomi read every clause carefully, not because she felt sentimental, but because she refused to allow a single gap to remain. Her hand stayed steady around the pen. Not once did it tremble. Claire noticed that, and she understood exactly what it meant. Naomi had moved beyond raw pain. She was standing somewhere colder now, in that place where women no longer cry. They calculate. When her pen slid across the final signature line, Naomi did not feel as though she had just lost her home. She felt as though she had just cut the first noose from her neck. Julian signed after her. The lawyers exchanged documents. The notary confirmed the originals. The rustle of paper, the click of pens against the table, the soft movement of chairs. Together they formed a kind of clean sound, almost purifying. An hour later, they were at the private banking center to complete the transfer. The private room was so quiet that the bank employee's keystrokes sounded like the ticking of a clock. Naomi handed over the new account number Claire had opened for her overnight. A fully separate account. No links, No supplementary access. No door through which Adrian could slip. While they waited for confirmation, Naomi's phone vibrated. Adrian Wells lit up the screen. Naomi looked at the name without any expression. She had not blocked him the night before. Not because she was soft, but because part of her wanted to see which lie he would lead with once the financial system beneath his feet had just been ripped away. The first message appeared. "Where are you? I called home and no one answered." The second came immediately after, with the rhythm of concern already rehearsed. "This is strange. I was trying to buy you something at the airport, but my card got declined. Can you check what's going on?" Naomi stared at the words for a long moment. For one very brief second, she felt physically sick at the sheer shamelessness of the man. He had just staged a secret wedding, and now he was back to playing the gentle husband trying to buy his wife a gift. Anyone who had not seen that photo with their own eyes might have been fooled by the tone. On the other side of the country, Adrian was standing in an upscale airport lounge, trying to hide his irritation. The card being declined in front of the sales clerk had humiliated him, especially with Sienna standing beside him, already frowning. He was not truly afraid yet, just annoyed. In his mind, Naomi was either angry or the bank had made an error, or everything would be fixed with a single call. That was the habit of people who have lived too long on comfort provided by someone else. They assume the system will always catch them when they slip. Sienna was different. Since the night before, she had begun to feel a thin, invisible crack forming beneath everything. When Adrian forced a smile and tried to reassure her, when Lorraine snapped that Naomi would fall in line eventually, Sienna still felt uneasy. She did not understand all of Adrian's finances, but she understood one thing very clearly. A woman like Naomi is not silent because she is weak. She is silent because she is thinking. Naomi's phone vibrated again. A banking notification flashed across the screen. Transaction successful. $12.8 million deposited. In that single moment, no one but Naomi knew that one door had just slammed shut behind Adrian. The lakefront estate was no longer a place he could return to. No longer a place where he could stand in the middle of the wide living room, pour a drink, and explain things away in that familiar tone of his. It belonged to someone else now. The banker smiled politely and confirmed the new balance. Claire glanced at Naomi and said nothing, but her eyes carried a quiet acknowledgement. The first strike had landed exactly where it needed to. Naomi set her phone down on the table. Then, with complete calm, she opened another banking app. The joint account appeared, with the balance she had seen hundreds of times before. Household money, bills, maintenance, miscellaneous expenses from a polished false life. $140,000. Naomi hit transfer. The money drained out of the joint account in a matter of seconds, like water rushing from a tub after the plug had been pulled. The new balance appeared. 0. She felt no thrill, only order. Then Naomi lifted her eyes to the bank manager. "I am the primary cardholder. I want every supplementary card and every line of credit access connected to Adrian Wells permanently revoked, effective immediately." The manager hesitated slightly at the firmness in her voice, but remained professional. "May I ask the reason, ma'am?" Naomi answered without blinking. "I suspect a risk of financial misuse." No further explanation was needed. The manager nodded and began working through the system. A few minutes later, he confirmed that every supplementary card had been deactivated. Every linked access point had been removed. The paths Adrian had always assumed were his by right had vanished completely, as if they had never existed. Naomi's phone vibrated again. This time Adrian's messages came in faster. "Naomi, answer me. What did you do to the card? I need it right now." Reading those words, Naomi felt a strange emptiness. For years that man had lived in her house, driven her cars, spent from the accounts she funded, held a title in the company she built, and still managed to betray her as if he were the center of everything. The deepest obscenity in Adrian was not the affair. It was his belief that Naomi would always remain the ground beneath him, ground that would never dare to push back. Naomi replied to only one message. "Come home soon. I've prepared a surprise for you and your new bride." She sent it, watched the screen for one more second, then blocked Adrian's number. Next came Lorraine, then his sister, then two other relatives who had too often meddled in the affairs of the Wells family. Each block felt like another door closing. No noise, no theatrics, but absolute. When everything was done, Naomi left the private banking center with Claire. The afternoon wind moved through the polished stone lobby, carrying that faint metallic freshness city air sometimes has after noon. Claire asked quietly, "Are you all right?" Naomi looked out toward the sun-drenched street, where traffic kept moving as if this were an ordinary day. "Not yet," she answered honestly. "But I've got my hands back on the wheel." Claire said nothing more, because she understood that for a woman like Naomi, that was the only truth that mattered. That afternoon, back at the hotel, Naomi set her bag down on the sofa and stood by the window, looking out over the whole city spread beneath her. She had sold the house, moved the money, emptied the joint account, cut the cards, shut down Adrian's return path through money. Phase 1 was complete. But in the reflection on the glass, Naomi's eyes had not softened, because she knew something with complete certainty. Losing the house was not the hardest blow Adrian was about to take. Losing the money was not either. Tomorrow, she would walk into the company, and there, more doors were still waiting for her to open. The next day, Naomi Carter did not return to the conference room, and she did not give herself one more morning to breathe. She went straight to the next battlefield. The North Crest Hospitality Projects building stood in the Northern Commercial District, its gray-blue glass reflecting the cold, high Chicago sky. People passing by still believed this was the place where Adrian Wells had built his name, the place he walked into every morning like a successful man, admired, respected, empowered. No one knew that beneath that polished glass facade, the real power belonged to someone else. Naomi had never stepped forward to claim the spotlight. She built the stage, then moved into the wings, believing that doing so would ease her husband's insecurity. Now that very retreat had become a deadly advantage. Naomi stepped out of the car in a pale cream suit, her hair pinned neatly up, sunglasses shielding half her face. The security guard at the entrance bowed instinctively, the way people do when they understand that certain figures may not appear often, but when they do, the atmosphere around them changes on its own. She crossed the lobby past the reception desk, neither hurried nor slow. Her heels struck the polished stone floor one measured step at a time, dry and precise. The young receptionist looked up and started to greet her in the proper professional tone, but stopped mid-sentence. Naomi did not need to announce her title. The moment people saw her, they understood she was not an ordinary visitor. "I'm here to see Marcus Reed," Naomi said, "right now." The receptionist swallowed and immediately called up to the finance floor. In the few seconds while the line connected, Naomi let her eyes sweep across the vast lobby. Screens promoting new hotel projects, interior models arranged inside glass cases, seasonal mood boards refreshed with meticulous care. Everything was still beautiful, still bright, still running like a polished machine. But Naomi knew that behind that perfection, money had been bent out of shape, signatures had been abused, and expenditures had been wrapped in harmless corporate language smooth enough to keep people from looking too closely. Elsewhere, Adrian was waking up in a state of irritation and exhaustion. He had barely slept the night before because Naomi had blocked his number, and Lorraine had spent hours raging while insisting that once he made it home, everything would be forced back into place. He still did not understand the scale of the storm bearing down on him. In Adrian's mind, at most, Naomi was punishing him emotionally. He had no idea that at this very moment, the woman he had underestimated was walking into the headquarters of the company he still believed belonged to him. The elevator opened onto the finance floor. Marcus Reed was already waiting. Marcus was the sort of man who made people think immediately of perfectly aligned columns of numbers and balance sheets without a single misplaced decimal. He was in his 40s, lean, careful, ruled by principle. The moment he saw Naomi step out, his expression changed visibly. Not because he was completely shocked, but because the instincts of a finance man told him that if Naomi had come here without warning, then things were far worse than even he had feared. "Miss Carter," he said, "what happened?" Naomi walked past him, her voice low but sharp as a honed blade. "A great many things. And I need all spending data, budget approvals, payment requests, travel reimbursements, and vendor files connected to Adrian from the past 6 months. Right now." Marcus shut the door to his private office behind them. The room was quiet, the blinds half drawn, a large screen on the wall displaying the quarterly financial dashboard. He turned back to face Naomi. In his eyes there was both concern and a strange flicker of relief. Relief that, at last, the person with the real authority had arrived. "I know there were a few expenses that looked wrong," Marcus said slowly. "But Adrian always used the excuse of confidential projects and demanded immediate disbursement. He applied a lot of pressure." Naomi pulled out a chair and sat down. "Start with the Toronto trip. No, wait. Start with everything you ever found unusual." Marcus sat at the computer. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. File after file opened. Line after line of spending appeared. At first, they were only small entries that looked perfectly reasonable to a careless eye. Business class airfare, luxury hotel charges, client hospitality, partner gifts, branding consultancy. But Naomi was not a careless reader. She looked at it the way someone looks at a system she built with her own hands. She knew what real costs looked like. She knew what dirty money looked like once it had been painted over. "Here," Marcus said, opening a detailed report. The Toronto trip from 3 days ago was logged as a franchise partner meeting. Flights, resort, internal transportation, some hospitality costs. Naomi held out her hand. "Open the attached invoices." Marcus enlarged the file. Naomi only needed one look. The destination did not match. The accommodation listed was a winery resort in a Western Valley, nowhere near Toronto. Dinners filed under business hospitality codes had taken place in restaurants inside a couple's retreat. Naomi handed Marcus her phone. "Read this." Marcus looked at the screen. It was a message Adrian had sent Naomi over a month earlier, complaining that the company budget was tight and asking her to transfer $2,000 in advance for an important business trip. Beneath it was proof that Naomi had transferred the money from her personal account to his. Marcus looked up, his face gone pale. The company already paid for this entire trip. That means he billed it twice. Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Not means. That is double billing." She did not say it loudly, but each word dropped into the room like a block of ice. Marcus swallowed hard. In all his years in finance, he had seen people bend procedures, inflate expenses, polish ugly reports. But the sight of a wife calmly identifying both betrayal and embezzlement in the same man, in the same flat tone someone might use to point out a system error, was something Marcus had never seen before. He opened more accounts. And as the layers began to peel away, Adrian's true face emerged faster than even Naomi had expected. Lavish dinners labeled as client care, designer goods tagged as partner gifts, a jewelry invoice for $5,000 with the note reading, "Appreciation gift for the wife of an investor." Naomi looked at that one for a long time. She could not remember ever receiving such a gift, but she knew exactly who might have. Sienna. Marcus moved into the section for new vendors created over the past half year. One name appeared on screen. Blue Harbor Strategic, LLC. Naomi stared at the name without moving. Open every transaction tied to it. Marcus did. Transfer after transfer appeared. Twice a month, sometimes 3 times, amounts ranging from $25,000 to $40,000. Every one of them was coded under Strategic Brand Consulting, Market Trend Analysis, or Customer Experience Optimization. Beautiful labels, professional labels, clean labels. Too clean. "Is there a contract?" Naomi asked. Marcus shook his head, shame and anger crossing his face at once. "That's what bothered me. Adrian always said it was a sensitive vendor, part of a highly confidential project. He kept the contract himself. He'd only give the final approval order and demand the transfer be processed immediately." Naomi stared straight at the screen. The numbers lay there, cold and bright. To most people, money is abstract. To Naomi, money had always had a shape. Every expense had a scent, a trajectory, a sound of its own. And the scent of this money was deception. She pulled out her phone and called Claire. "I need a corporate lookup immediately," she said the moment Claire answered. "Blue Harbor Strategic, LLC. I'm sending you the tax number. Find the owner. Find the registered address. Find everything." While waiting for a response, Naomi instructed Marcus to open access logs, approval emails, and system override records. A wider picture began to emerge. Adrian had bypassed 2-step approvals again and again using his operations authority. He had marked things urgent himself, branded them confidential himself, turned every question into evidence of non-cooperation. 15 minutes later, Naomi's phone vibrated. Claire did not waste a second. "The registered address is a commercial mailbox, no physical office. The sole owner is Sienna Hart." A heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus blinked as though someone had slapped him. He took off his glasses, wiped them automatically, then put them back on. But the screen in front of him had not changed. Sienna's name was still there in internal emails, meeting schedules, and travel orders with Adrian under the title of Branding Support. Naomi ended the call. She looked at Marcus. Total amount. Marcus typed quickly. The system calculated and added. The final figure appeared like a sentence being handed down. $450,000. "Add the double billing, the personal purchases," Naomi said, "and the false hospitality expenses." Marcus drew in a slow breath. "Over $500,000, ma'am." Naomi stood. In that moment, Marcus looked at her differently. No longer as the quiet principal who occasionally checked in. No longer as a wife who had just been betrayed. He was looking at the woman who truly held the bloodstream of this company in her hands. The woman Adrian and so many others had mistaken for a polite shadow lingering behind the curtains. "Print all of it," Naomi said. "Statements, invoices, system logs, override emails, Blue Harbor corporate registration. I want the dossier thick enough that if I throw it onto a table, no one will dare say a word." Marcus nodded at once. "One more thing," Naomi continued, and now there was not a trace of warmth left in her voice. "Draft termination notices for Adrian Wells and Sienna Hart. Effective immediately upon issuance. Grounds: severe ethical misconduct, fund misappropriation, and conflict of interest causing material harm to the company. Marcus looked up. He did not ask a single question. Yes, ma'am. Naomi stepped toward the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city. Below them, traffic moved like blood through the veins of some enormous body. No one out there knew that on this floor, a false empire had just been ripped open. Adrian still thought he was flying home to negotiate. Sienna still believed all she needed was the pregnancy and her hold on him. Lorraine still believed Naomi's money was something that could be controlled through family pressure. They had no idea that from this moment on, the rules of the game had changed. And Naomi Carter was no longer opening doors one by one. She was tearing the hinges clean off. Naomi Carter did not leave the building immediately after ordering the full dossier to be printed. She remained for several more minutes in front of the wide glass panel in the finance office, looking down at the city stretched beneath her like a giant chessboard that had just turned its black pieces face up. From that height, Chicago was still beautiful in a cold, unforgiving way. Traffic kept moving. Sunlight slid across rooftops. Signs gleamed. Everything looked calm to the point of absurdity. But Naomi knew with perfect clarity that somewhere beneath that smooth rhythm, a false empire was beginning to crack from the inside. Behind her, Marcus Reed and 2 trusted staff members kept the printers running non-stop. The machines worked without pause, stacks of paper sliding out in dry, relentless waves, carrying numbers, invoices, emails, wire instructions, reconciliations, system logs, and everything Adrian had once believed would stay buried beneath the polished exterior of a rising company. Nothing was hidden anymore. Money always knows how to leave footprints. The only question is whether anyone is clear-minded enough to see them. Naomi turned around. When the dossier is finished, send 1 copy to Claire's office. Lock 1 copy in the safe here. I'm taking 1 with me. Marcus nodded. He no longer felt as if he were taking instructions from a discreet majority shareholder. The woman standing in front of him was someone who had allowed too many people to live off her light for so long that they had forgotten who the real son was. Realizing that, Marcus felt ashamed of himself. He had suspected things. He had seen signs. But he had still let Adrian push forward because he assumed Naomi was too busy, too distant, or too trusting of her husband to look down into these darker corners. The truth was not that Naomi had been blind. She had simply stayed silent until she had enough reason to strike. The phone in Naomi's hand vibrated. Claire Donovan was calling. I've reorganized the legal paths, Claire said the moment Naomi picked up. Come to my office as soon as you can. I want to split everything into 3 separate tracks so we don't miss a single link. Naomi did not hesitate. She left Northcrest with the first stack of documents and went straight to the law office. On the drive there, the city passed behind the dark glass of her car like a silent film. Naomi did not turn on music. She did not check the news. She let her mind go nowhere except to the next thing that needed to be done. The farther she moved, the more sharply she felt something strange. The pain was still there, but it was no longer leading her. Clarity was driving now. Claire was already waiting in the smaller meeting room in the back. On the table lay 3 thick folders marked with different colored tabs. The moment the door closed, Claire pushed each one toward Naomi. 1 is divorce and asset separation, she said. 2 is embezzlement and financial fraud at Northcrest. 3 is the insurance file. I'm not prepared to call it a criminal conspiracy outright yet, not without more evidence, but it is serious enough to keep in its own category. Naomi sat down, her eyes moving over the 3 folders. Claire continued, her voice smooth and sharp. On the first track, you are in a very strong position. The estate has been sold, the joint account is empty, The supplementary cards are cancelled. Most major assets are either in your name or under your control. On the second track, what Marcus sent is already close to enough to report suspected embezzlement at a serious level. On the third, I've asked an insurance specialist to dig deeper into that policy. The fact that Sienna is listed as beneficiary at all is already a deeply sick signal. Naomi listened without interrupting. Some words become sharper than knives when they are spoken by a lawyer. Sick. That was exactly the right word for everything Adrian and his family had done. There's one more thing, Claire said, pulling out a stack of screenshots. Maya sent these from her phone, the Wells family group chat. Naomi took them. The messages made the air in the room feel heavier. Months earlier, Lorraine had already been hinting that Adrian needed a woman who would put family before ambition. His sister had dropped vague lines about a major change coming soon. One of his aunts had even shared photos of baby clothes with a joke about how the Wells family would finally hear a child in the house before long. No one mentioned Naomi by name, but anyone reading it would understand that they had all been waiting for the day she would be pushed out of the family portrait. Naomi set the phone down. Her lips moved slightly, but they were not trembling. It was only the last layer of disappointment sliding off her like dust. Claire looked at her. Do you still want to send that gift? Naomi lifted her eyes. No, I don't just want to anymore. I need to do it right. The two of them began arranging everything as though they were preparing a ritual. Not a ritual of emotional revenge, but a ritual of justice, wrapped in black velvet and silver paper. Claire called Northcrest and instructed them to finalize the termination notices for Adrian Wells and Sienna Hart. The language had to be airtight. The wording had to stay clean. The grounds had to be precise. Revoke all system access, company property, and authority to represent the company immediately. Each letter had to be printed on heavy paper and stamped properly, so that in the hands of the recipient it would not look like a burst of anger. It had to look like a verdict. After that, Naomi texted Julian Mercer. Her message was short. Around noon tomorrow, a few people may come looking for the old house. They do not have the right to enter. Please instruct security to handle it according to protocol. Julian replied almost immediately. You have my word. Anyone without rights will not get through the gate. Naomi read the message, and inside her a cold, perfectly rounded stillness rose. It felt like a door locked from the inside. On the other side of the country, Adrian still did not understand why Naomi had vanished after that final message. He could not call her. His texts went nowhere. The credit cards remained as useless as dead pieces of plastic. The closer it got to his return flight to Chicago, the more irritable he became. But buried inside that irritation was a stupid kind of arrogance. He thought Naomi was overreacting to make a point. He thought that once he got home, stood in front of her, and used that familiar voice of his, everything could still be negotiated. Lorraine was different. After the phone call the night before, a thin veil of unease had settled inside her like smoke. She hated the feeling, so she tried to crush it under arrogance. She called several relatives and told them to be ready to come to the estate on the day Adrian returned. Her intention was obvious. If Naomi dared to resist, they would use family pressure to force her back into place. In Lorraine's mind, no matter how strong a woman appeared, she would always fear isolation in the end. She had no idea she was leading her entire family toward a stage Naomi had already built for them. Sienna, meanwhile, sat in the luxury hotel suite, reorganizing her cosmetics and the things she had just bought, while her unease sharpened into something clearer. The more irritable Adrian became, the more afraid she grew. Not because she feared losing him, because she feared he did not truly own anything the way he had always claimed. The child inside her had once felt like a ticket into a life of wealth. Now it was beginning to feel like a chain. By late afternoon, Naomi and Claire finished the gift box. It was wrapped in matte silver paper, tied with a black ribbon. Not too extravagant, not sentimental. Beautiful in a cold, sealed way that made anyone looking at it feel both curious and uneasy. Inside were 2 thick envelopes, one for Adrian, one for Sienna. Beneath the velvet lining was a handwritten card from Naomi. Her script was straight, sharp, composed. To the newlyweds, this is the first gift. Naomi paused for one beat, then wrote the line she knew would cut deepest of all. And by the way, Adrian, North Crest was never yours. I control 90%. You were just fired from my asset. The main gift is still on its way. Naomi set down the pen. Claire looked at the card and said nothing. Some sentences do not need another word added to them. They are already enough to bring down a life. Once the box was sealed, Maya stepped in to confirm the delivery details. The young woman looked at Naomi with a mixture of admiration and emotion so tight it nearly hurt. The night before, Maya had sat alone in her small apartment reading through the Wells family messages, furious enough to shake. She had always thought that once a woman reached Naomi's level, there was nothing left she needed to fear. Only now did she understand that the more successful a woman becomes, the more likely people are to assume she no longer needs protection, no longer deserves tenderness, perhaps not even the right to be wounded. Maya asked quietly, "Are you sure you want to witness it all yourself?" Naomi looked through the glass, where the sky was darkening over the city rooftops. "I don't need to witness it for satisfaction," she said. "I need to be there to finish it." By the time night had fully fallen, everything was finally in place. The files had been sent, the paperwork had been prepared, the termination notices had been printed, the gift box had been sealed, the message had been delivered. Security at the new estate had their instructions, and Claire had quietly set a few preliminary financial investigation channels in motion. At the end of the day, Naomi stood alone in the hotel room, a glass of water in her hand, forgotten. Below her, the city shone, beautiful and distant. In the reflection on the window, she looked slender, but not fragile. Anyone who had ever looked at Naomi and thought she was a woman raised by comfort had been completely wrong. Naomi was not made by ease. She was made by discipline, by nights of working until exhaustion, by the habit of laying foundations herself and silently carrying the weight of them. Adrian had never understood that, and because he never understood it, he was going to pay for it. Tomorrow, when his flight touched down in Chicago, he would bring back his new bride, his old lies, and the illusion that the gate to the lakefront estate would still open for him. Naomi set the glass of water down. Outside, the night was thickening layer by layer. Inside her, every last hesitation had gone dark. Tomorrow, the stage lights would come on. And this time, no one else would be choosing her role. The next day, the stage lights truly came on. Noon in Winnetka was heavier than usual. The sun beat down on the road in front of the lakefront estate like a sheet of heated metal, making the air tremble in warped, shimmering layers. A black taxi pulled up in front of the tall iron gate Adrian Wells had always treated as his rightful entrance. He stepped out first, yanking the door shut, his face tight with exhaustion, irritation, and the chain of frustrations that had followed him all the way back to Chicago. Sienna Hart climbed out after him more slowly, one hand clutching a designer handbag, the other dragging a large suitcase she had just bought. Her heels sank slightly into the hot pavement, and after the long trip, the makeup around her eyes had already begun to fade. She looked around, then frowned immediately. "Why isn't anyone here to greet us?" she asked, her voice edged with impatience and annoyance. "You said the driver would be waiting." Adrian did not turn around. He was too tired to soothe her now. The credit cards were dead. Calling Naomi had gotten him nowhere. Lorraine kept ordering him to stay calm, even as panic had already begun creeping into her own voice. The entire trip back from the airport had been soaked in irritation, but Adrian still clung to one last scrap of illusion. If he could just get through that gate, step back into the house, face Naomi directly, then somehow everything could still be managed. He still believed in the force of his own presence inside the house Naomi had bought. He still believed that a betrayed woman would eventually soften the moment she saw her husband standing in front of her. He pulled the remote from his pocket and pressed the button. Nothing happened. The towering iron gate remained still, cold and sealed shut. Adrian frowned and pressed it again. Then again. The soft clicking sound from the remote was pitifully small against the suffocating noon heat. What the hell is this? Sienna lifted a hand to block the sun, her voice growing sharper. Adrian, I'm standing out here in the street. I can't stay here like this. He did not answer. The frustration that had been building since the airport was beginning to boil. Adrian strode up to the gate, held the remote directly against the sensor, and kept pressing it as if enough force might somehow make the metal remember that it used to belong to him. It still did not open. Behind the gate, a small glass window in the security booth slid open. A tall man stepped out, not the old guard Adrian was used to ordering around. This one had broad shoulders, an expressionless face, a spotless uniform, and eyes that held not the slightest flicker of recognition or deference. Sir, can I help you? Adrian spun around, his tone instantly hard and cutting. Open the gate. The remote's broken. The guard did not move. Who are you here to see, sir? For one brief second, Adrian thought he had heard wrong. Who are you here to see? He was standing right in front of the house he had walked into for years, and some stranger in a guard's uniform was asking him who he was here to see. Are you out of your mind? Adrian hissed through his teeth. This is my house. The guard's expression did not change. Sir, this property is now owned by Mr. Julian Mercer. If your name is not on the approved visitor list, I cannot let you in. The air around them seemed to crack in a single violent snap. Sienna reacted first. She stepped closer, her face flushed from the heat and pale from rising fear. What did he just say? Adrian turned toward her, his eyes wide with outrage more than comprehension. This is my house, he repeated, as though the truth might bend if he said it often enough. Mine and Naomi Carter's. Open the gate, now! This time the guard looked directly at him, still calm, as if reciting a rule he already knew by heart. The title transfer was completed yesterday. The previous owner, Ms. Naomi Carter, handed over the keys. I have been instructed not to allow entry to anyone without legal authorization. Sienna froze. The suitcase slipped from her hand and fell heavily onto the road with a rough, ugly sound. In her mind, all the beautiful images of the future began to tilt and shake. That lakefront estate was not just a house. It was proof of everything Adrian had promised her. Status, security, a life. Assurance that she would not enter the future empty-handed, with a growing child inside her. Sold, she whispered, her voice stripped of the sharpness it had held seconds earlier. Adrian, did he just say the house was sold? Adrian looked at her, then back at the gate, as if reality might correct itself if he moved quickly enough. But it did not. The truth remained there, tall and cold, made of iron and guarded by a man who did not know him at all. That's impossible, he said, softer now, almost as if speaking to himself. Naomi can't sell that house without my consent. That sentence alone revealed how little he had ever understood Naomi. Behind them, a silver utility vehicle turned into the private drive and stopped abruptly behind the taxi. The doors opened. Lorraine Wells stepped out first, followed by Adrian's sister and two older relatives. They had arrived with an entirely different mindset. Lorraine was dressed neatly, pearls at her throat, her eyes bright with the determination of someone preparing to walk into a family confrontation. In her mind, the plan was still perfectly clear. She and the rest of the family would go inside. Adrian would speak to Naomi. Sienna would remain in an awkward but protected position because of the pregnancy. The family would pressure Naomi into accepting reality. Then Lorraine saw the scene in front of her. Adrian stood outside the gate, his shirt wrinkled, his face flushed red, his eyes full of uncontrolled fury. Sienna stood frozen beside the fallen suitcase. A strange guard blocked the entrance like a wall. Lorraine hurried toward them.
What is going on here?
Adrian turned to his mother. In that moment, there was not a trace of polish left in his face. Only the disorientation of a man who had just been rejected by the world at the very threshold he thought belonged to him. "The house is sold," he blurted out, his voice breaking. "Naomi sold it." Lorraine stopped dead. It was not that she did not understand the words, it was that her mind refused to accept them. Sold? Sold by who? Sold what? That estate had been her pride for years, the thing she had flaunted to relatives again and again, the place she had entered as the mother-in-law of a wealthy female owner, the place she had treated as Wells family property, even though, on paper, she had never owned so much as a brick. She whipped around toward the guard. "Say that again." He answered in the same flat tone. "Ma'am, ownership has been transferred to Mr. Julian Mercer. The previous owner, Ms. Naomi Carter, completed the handover yesterday." The color drained from Lorraine's face within seconds. She staggered slightly, just enough that the relative beside her had to catch her elbow. But Adrian looked worse. He swung back toward the gate, his whole body trembling with humiliation and rage, and slammed his hand against the bars. "Naomi!" His shout tore out of him, harsh and ragged. "Naomi, come out here!" No one answered. The estate stood silent behind the gate, its pale windows gleaming in the sunlight like the eyes of a creature that had changed owners, and was now observing the strangers outside with cold indifference. In that moment, everything Lorraine had planned to say to Naomi dissolved into smoke. She no longer held any position from which to force anyone into anything. She did not even have the right to pass through the gate. Sienna looked from one face to another. Fear inside her transformed into anger almost instantly. Because ambition like hers is always fragile. Once the first layer of gold peels away, what lies underneath is usually panic. And panic is rarely graceful. "You said this house was yours," she hissed through her teeth. "You said once we got back, everything would fall into place." Adrian did not answer. He was still gripping the iron bars as though he could bend them with his hands. Lorraine turned on Sienna almost immediately, her instinct to find a scapegoat rising faster than panic itself. "If you hadn't gotten pregnant and rushed everything into chaos, none of this would have happened." Sienna whipped around, eyes blazing. "What did you just say? You were the one who pushed this forward. You were the one who said Naomi only knew how to make money and wouldn't dare do anything." The words landed like a slap in the middle of the blazing noon. The relatives who had come with them all shifted back slightly, as if instinct were warning them to step away from ground that was beginning to sink. This was no longer a family negotiation. It was turning into a ridiculous public unraveling in the middle of a sun-baked street, where every mask was beginning to fall away at once. Then Adrian remembered something. He released the gate, dug into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. If he could not get into the house, then there was still money, the joint account. At the very least, he could take Sienna to a hotel, calm his mother down, and buy time to find Naomi. He opened the banking app with fingers shaking from heat and rage. The password worked. The account loaded. The balance was 0. Adrian blinked. Then he tapped again. Refresh, log out, log back in. Still 0. The world beneath his feet seemed to tip sharply. Sienna saw the color change in his face before she heard the words. She grabbed his arm. "What is it? Tell me." Adrian looked up. Sweat was running down his temples, but what chilled him had nothing to do with the sun. "She drained it," he said, his voice dry as paper. "The joint account is empty." A gust of wind blew in from the lake just then, not cool enough to offer relief, only sharp enough to make the silence between them feel harder. Lorraine took another step back. She looked at her son, the sealed gate, the house she could not enter, then at Sienna and the suitcase abandoned on the ground. At last, though only in part, she began to understand. Naomi had not reacted impulsively. Naomi had planned this, step by step, door by door. And now all of them, the people who had been so certain she would do nothing but cry, were standing in the street like strangers. Adrian tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles turned white. The air around him was thick with humiliation. And this was only the beginning. The chaos at the gate had not even begun to settle when the sound of a motorcycle engine came from the far end of the lake road. It was a small, ordinary sound, almost out of place against the heavy air thick with sun, rage, and humiliation hanging over the Wells family. Then the blue delivery bike pulled up just behind the taxi, and the driver stepped off carrying a large box wrapped in matte silver paper, tied with a neat black ribbon. For a moment, everyone fell silent. Adrian was still holding his phone, the banking app glowing with that 0 on the screen like a wound of humiliation that had not had time to close. Sienna stood beside the fallen suitcase, her eyes still red from panic and anger. Lorraine was breathing hard, one hand pressed to her chest as if her body could no longer keep pace with the speed of everything collapsing around her. The delivery driver glanced down at the information on his phone, then looked up. "Are Mr. Adrian Wells and Miss Sienna Hart here?" Sienna reacted first. She stepped forward half a pace, her voice still trembling, but now edged with a flicker of hope. "That's me. What is this?" The driver checked the code again, then held out the signature device. "There's a package for the two of you at this address. Please confirm receipt." A package. That single word was enough to change the look in Sienna's eyes. For one brief second, her ambition rose again like a fish refusing to die. Maybe Naomi had changed her mind. Maybe it was a check to buy her silence. Maybe it was jewelry. Maybe it was proof that the legal wife had finally understood she had no choice but to step aside. Lorraine lifted her head sharply too. The humiliation of being locked out of the gate had not faded yet, but greed stirred before it was even gone. If Naomi had sent a gift, then the girl was still afraid, still trying to cling to some position, still not hard enough to push everything all the way to the edge. Adrian was the only one who felt no ease at all. He stared at the silver box with a heavy knot in his stomach. Naomi was not the kind of woman who sent gifts to make peace, not after what he and his family had done. Instinct told him that whatever was inside that box was not surrender. It was a message. And Naomi had never sent messages without meaning. The driver repeated himself, growing impatient. "Please sign." Adrian snatched the device and signed carelessly, almost scraping his name across the screen. The driver handed him the box, offered a brief, polite farewell, and left. The motorcycle disappeared around the bend in seconds, leaving them there in the noon heat, in front of the sealed gate, with the box resting on top of the suitcase like some foreign object dropped from the sky. Sienna bent down and looked at the black ribbon. "There's a card." A small note had been fastened neatly beside the ribbon. Sienna pulled it free, her pale pink nails trembling just slightly. Adrian recognized the handwriting instantly, even without a signature. Naomi Sienna swallowed hard, then read it aloud. To the newlyweds, this is the first gift. No one said anything for several seconds after that. The words, newlyweds, hung in the air like a congratulation dipped in poison. No screaming, no insults, no pleading. Just a sentence, elegant, cold, exact. That calmness was what made it so frightening. "Open it," Lorraine said suddenly, her voice sharp with urgency. "Hurry up!" Adrian set the box down more carefully on the suitcase. His palm was damp with sweat. The black ribbon slipped away easily, almost too easily, as if the sender had never intended for him to struggle with it. The silver paper peeled back in layers. Inside was a hard, flat black box without a logo, without decoration. Only the kind of minimalism so cold it made the skin tighten, the kind that knows it does not need ornament to inflict damage. The lid came open. No diamonds, no money, no apology. Inside were only 2 thick envelopes made of expensive white paper, each one sealed with absolute precision. On both of them was the logo of North Crest Hospitality Projects. One was addressed to Adrian Wells, the other to Sienna Hart. The company name hit Adrian like a punch. He froze. Sienna frowned, a bad feeling spreading through her body with brutal speed. She snatched up her envelope first, while Adrian opened his more slowly. Suddenly, none of them thought of it as a gift anymore. Even Lorraine could feel her throat beginning to dry. Sienna tore the seal first. The thick paper opened with a rustling sound far too loud in the silence of the summer noon. Her eyes moved quickly across the first few lines, then stopped. Every trace of color drained from her face. "No!" she burst out, her voice splintering. "No, that's impossible!" Adrian had opened his letter too. He read it fast, too fast, like a man afraid the words would drive their nails deeper if he let himself take them in slowly. Immediate termination of employment due to serious ethical misconduct, conflict of interest, abuse of authority, and actions causing material harm to the company. Revocation of all system access. Revocation of company assets. Revocation of title. Return of company vehicle within 24 hours. No severance, no settlement privileges, no exit benefits due to the severity of the violations. For exactly 1 second, Adrian felt his mind go blank. Then heat surged through him, wild and violent. "What the hell is this?" Sienna held up the letter as if raising it high enough might shame reality into retreating. "They fired me! Adrian, they fired me!" Her voice shot into the air, shrill and splitting. Adrian's sister instinctively stepped back. One of the older relatives frowned at the letter as if it were something contaminated. The scene in front of the estate no longer looked like a return home. It looked like a public sentencing in the middle of the noon sun, where every prize they thought they were about to claim was being thrown back into their faces in the form of a ruling. Lorraine snatched the letter from her son's hand. "Let me see it." She read. And the more she read, the harder her hand began to shake, not with age, with the shock of seeing money, power, and order, the very things she had always believed she could manipulate, all turned their backs on her at once. The wording in the letter was too clean, too exact. There was not a single opening for emotion to slip through. This was not the language of a jealous woman. This was the language of the company, of the law, of a system formally cutting someone out the way a body cuts out dead tissue. "Adrian," she said, her voice hoarse. "How dare they do this to you? You're the operations director there." The moment the words left her mouth, Adrian saw the second card resting near the bottom of the box. A freezing instinct shot through the back of his neck. He bent down and picked it up. Naomi's handwriting appeared again, beautiful, straight, and composed with a cruelty so calm it was worse than rage. Adrian read it silently first. His face changed at once. Sienna's eyes narrowed. "What does it say?" Adrian did not answer. He simply stood there, the card caught between two fingers, looking as if someone had just peeled the outer layer off his skin. Lorraine tried to grab it, but he held on tighter by reflex. Not to protect Naomi's secret, because the lines on that card were too humiliating to be spoken aloud. Sienna lost patience and lunged for his arm. "What does it say?" At last, Adrian spoke. His voice was no longer the voice of the man who used to walk into boardrooms radiating control. It came out warped, dry, almost unrecognizable. "She says Northcrest was never mine." No one breathed. Adrian swallowed with difficulty, then kept reading, each word sounding as though it had to be forced through his throat. "She controls 90%. I was just fired from her asset." The air seemed to collapse. Sienna let go of him first, as if she had touched something filthy and wanted it off her skin. In her mind, all the glittering images of a future beside Adrian shattered at once. This man had not built the company. He was not the master of the life he had bragged about. He was not the center of power he had always pretended to be. He was just a man his wife had placed in the most flattering part of the spotlight, so he would not have to feel small. Lorraine took another step back. She looked at her son as if he were a stranger. For years she had taken pride in Adrian, pride in his title, in the house he lived in the cars he drove, in the success he wore like a custom-tailored suit. Now, one by one, each of those things was being exposed as clothing Naomi had paid for and draped over him. "That can't be," Lorraine whispered. "I thought that company—" She did not finish, because in that moment, she understood she had never really known anything at all. She had only lived on what other people allowed her to believe. Sienna laughed, a short laugh, broken and sour like cracked glass. "So you never really had anything, did you, Adrian? The house isn't yours. The company isn't yours. The money isn't yours." Adrian spun toward her, his eyes bloodshot. "Shut up." But Sienna had gone too far to stop now. Fear turns vicious very quickly in people who realize they have wagered their entire future on a lie. "You told me I'd live like a queen," she hissed. "You said everything would be ours." "I said shut up!" The whole group stood there under the blazing sun, in front of a gate that would not open, among suitcases, termination letters, and a truth stripped down to the bone. No one had any dignity left. No one looked like the winner from yesterday's wedding photo. They were just people, yanked out of their parasitic dream at the precise second they believed they had reached the finish line. Adrian bent toward the box again. At the bottom edge of the card there was one more line. He read it, and this time his hand truly began to shake. "The main gift is still on its way." A chill crawled up his spine in the middle of the noon heat. The main gift. So everything that had happened from yesterday until now still was not the whole of it. Selling the house was not the end. Draining the money was not the end. Firing them was not the end. Then what was left? Adrian lifted his head and scanned the empty road, like an animal beginning to smell the trap tightening around it. And right then, from far away, faint at first, and then clearer by the second, came the sound of a siren. Not an ambulance, not a neighborhood alarm. It was the sound of police cars slicing through the air as they came fast. The main gift had arrived. The wail of sirens tore through the thick air in front of the iron gate, skimming across the lake, crashing into the trees along the road, then driving straight into the chest of every person standing frozen beneath the sun. 2 police cars turned into the private drive leading to the estate, their red and blue lights cutting across the pavement like cold blades. Every argument that had erupted just a minute earlier was swallowed whole. Adrian Wells stood motionless, Naomi's card still clutched in his hand. The line about the main gift still being on its way had somehow become real sound, rushing toward him in the form of sirens and tires grinding over hot asphalt. The rage that had not yet faded from his face was suddenly crowded by something else. Not fear exactly, not at first. It was something closer to freefall, the moment a man realizes the floor beneath him was never really there. Sienna Hart was the first to step back. Her instincts were sharper than her pride. The second she saw the police insignia on the car doors, a sheet of cold ran down her spine. The termination letters, the sealed gate, the zero balance, none of it frightened her as much as the arrival of the law. Money can vanish. A house can vanish. But if she were taken away in front of everyone, every illusion she had built for her future would die on the spot. Lorraine Wells did not understand everything quickly enough. All she knew was that humiliation was piling on top of itself until it had become a wall too large to climb. The house was out of reach. Her son had been stripped of his dignity. The new bride had turned out to be a parasite clinging to another lie. And now the police were coming. Somewhere inside her, one last shard of pride still tried to rise, whispering that this must be a misunderstanding, that perhaps it was only about the scene at the gate. She did not yet have the courage to think anything worse. The car doors opened. An older officer stepped out first, broad-shouldered, his face stripped of any unnecessary expression. Beside him was a younger officer holding a slim folder. The other 2 remained near the cars, close enough to move in, their eyes never leaving Adrian and Sienna for even half a second. The older officer swept his gaze over the Wells family, then stopped on Adrian. "You are Adrian Wells." It was phrased like a question, but sounded like a conclusion. Adrian swallowed. He was still trying to keep his shoulders straight, trying to preserve what little remained of the polished exterior that had carried him through so many boardrooms and dinners. But that image now looked like an expensive suit on an actor who had forgotten his lines. "Yes, I'm Adrian Wells. What is this about?" His voice was dry, pitched half a note higher than normal. The younger officer opened the file, checked the photograph, then looked up. "And you are Sienna Hart." Sienna did not answer right away. She gripped the strap of her handbag so tightly her nails were nearly cutting into her skin. Everything inside her narrowed to a single point. No, not me. Not this fast. "Yes," she said very softly. The older officer nodded, then spoke in a voice that was even and firm. "We have received a formal complaint, along with initial evidence, concerning corporate embezzlement, fraudulent transactions, and abuse of managerial authority to move funds through an intermediary entity." Adrian laughed. Not because anything was funny. It was the reflex of a man pushed to the edge of a cliff, still clawing for whatever illusion had not yet fallen away. "You've got the wrong idea," he said quickly. "I'm the operations director of North Crest. I can't embezzle money from my own company." At that exact moment, a black sedan appeared quietly at the far end of the road. It did not rush forward. It did not move with urgency. It approached slowly, as though the person inside had not come to join the chaos, but to end a performance. When the car stopped, Naomi Carter stepped out. No one spoke at first, but the entire atmosphere shifted. Naomi wore an ivory silk blouse and dark wide-leg trousers, her hair swept into a low knot, dark sunglasses hiding half her face. There was not a trace of the betrayed wife the Wells family had imagined for the past 2 days. No red eyes, no broken expression, no delayed meltdown. She walked very slowly, but with every step the space in front of the gate seemed to tighten. Behind her came Claire Donovan, holding a slim black case file. Adrian looked at Naomi as though he were seeing someone rise out of ashes he himself had set on fire. For one flickering instant, he saw the woman who had once sat across from him at the dinner table, who had asked whether he had eaten, who had reminded him in a gentle voice not to work too late. Then the image vanished the moment Naomi took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were cold, not furious, not shaking. It was that calmness that frightened Adrian for the first time in a real way. "Naomi!" he burst out, almost shouting. "You called the police!" Naomi did not look at him first. She turned to the older officer. "Officer, my name is Naomi Carter. I am the controlling shareholder of Northcrest Hospitality Projects. I am the complainant." Claire stepped forward half a pace, opened the file case, and handed over a carefully prepared stack of documents. Inside are the initial records showing transfers to Blue Harbor Strategic LLC, instances of double billing, misuse of company funds, and the corporate registration showing Ms. Sienna Hart as the owner. We also have reconciliation reports for personal expenses disguised as client hospitality and strategic consulting. The younger officer took the file and flipped through the first few pages. It took only a glance or two for his expression to harden. Adrian felt everything slipping beyond his reach at a speed too fast to stop. He turned to Naomi, and this time, his voice changed completely. It was no longer loud. It was urgent, disordered. "Naomi, listen to me. You can't do this. We're husband and wife." Naomi finally looked straight at him. "Which husband, Adrian? The one who claimed he was away on business while holding a wedding with his mistress? The one who used company money to support her? Or the one who put her name down as the beneficiary of his wife's insurance policy?" That last sentence dropped like a block of ice. Lorraine went pale first. She looked at Naomi, then at Adrian, then back at Sienna, as if her eyes alone could force someone to stand up and insist the insurance policy was all some misunderstanding. But no one said a word. Sienna felt her legs go weak. She had once hoped Naomi might never find out. She had hoped the insurance file would remain hidden in the dark corner where so many other ugly things adults bury, and then continue living past. Now Naomi had spoken it aloud, in the middle of the day, in front of the police, in front of her mother-in-law, in front of family. There was nowhere left to hide. The older officer turned back to Adrian. "You and Ms. Sienna Hart will need to come with us to clarify the initial allegations. If you have an explanation, you may provide it at the station." "No," Adrian said immediately, taking half a step back. "No, you can't take me like this. This is defamation. This is slander. She's doing this to get revenge on me." Sienna turned at once, survival taking over. "I didn't know anything," she said, her voice rising. "I only did what Adrian told me. I didn't decide anything." Adrian snapped toward her. "Shut up!" That single shout tore through the last thread binding the two of them together. Naomi stood still, looking at them as if they were strangers ripping off their own masks right in front of her. For months they had used her money, her company, her house, her trust to weave a dream for themselves. Now they were trampling that dream flat with their own hands. The younger officer stepped forward. "Sir, cooperate." Real panic finally surged through Adrian. No longer irritation over lost money, no longer shame over the house. This was the panic of a man seeing an iron door closing in front of him. He moved quickly toward Naomi, his voice turning into a desperate plea. "Naomi, don't do this. I was wrong, I admit it, but you can't push me away like a criminal in front of everyone." Naomi did not step back. You did that to yourself." The answer was short, direct. It left no space for pity. And in that moment, something inside Adrian snapped. Fear turned into rage in the span of a heartbeat. He lunged toward Naomi, not close enough to touch her, but fast enough that the two officers immediately grabbed both of his arms. His whole body was pinned in the burning air. "This is all your fault," he shouted, his voice breaking apart. "If I lose everything, don't think you'll walk away untouched." That scream made Lorraine go cold. It was no longer the voice of an innocent son protesting injustice. It was the voice of a man who had just lost his final layer and exposed the raw violence underneath. Naomi stood close enough to see the vein throbbing in Adrian's neck with rage and panic. But she did not blink. Claire instinctively pulled her half a step back in protection. Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head, then turned to the officer. "Please note that threat. It supports my concerns regarding prior dangerous behavior and motive for unlawful gain." The older officer gave a short nod. "We heard it clearly." Cold metal flashed in the sunlight as the handcuffs came out. Adrian jerked once, uselessly. The cuffs locked behind his back with a short click, so final it was horrifying. That sound was like the last bolt sliding shut on everything he had once believed belonged to him. Sienna burst into tears. Not the tears of heartbreak, but the frantic crying of someone who realizes there is no one left to cling to. A female officer moved toward her. Sienna stepped back, caught her foot on the suitcase, and nearly fell. Lorraine opened her mouth, but no sound came out for several seconds. She only stared at her son, his hands cuffed, his face twisted by despair, and at last she understood. Naomi had not destroyed her family. Their greed had dragged them here. Adrian was led toward the police car. He twisted his head back for one last look at Naomi, his eyes so chaotic they looked as though they wanted to beg and curse her at the same time. Naomi did not say another word, because in that moment, the main gift had truly been delivered. And everything after that was only procedure. The paperwork of collapse. When the police car doors slammed shut in front of the iron gate, the sound did not just seal Adrian Wells and Sienna Hart inside a narrow compartment. It also sealed away Naomi Carter's old life, the life that had survived for far too long on patience, kindness, and trust placed in the wrong hands. The car pulled away, carrying with it Lorraine Wells's desperate cries for her son. Her voice was hoarse, twisted, stripped of every trace of the superiority she once used to judge Naomi across family dinners. The noon sun still flooded the road with harsh white light, but in Lorraine's eyes, everything had gone dark. She stood there on the curb, in front of a mansion that no longer belonged to her family, in front of relatives retreating in embarrassment, and at last she touched the most terrifying truth of all. Naomi had not stolen their future. They had burned it down themselves with greed. Naomi did not stay long. She got into the car with Claire Donovan and left Winnetka just as the first curious onlookers began appearing at the end of the street. People are always quick to smell collapse. But Naomi did not look back. She sat in silence, eyes turned toward the window, letting the city slide past like a film that no longer had anything to do with her. Claire was the first to break the silence. "From here on, this becomes a different kind of fight," she said. "Slower, cleaner, and crueler." Naomi nodded. She understood. The dramatic scene at the gate had only been the opening shot. From this point forward, the real battlefield would lie in documents, testimonies, money trails, reconciliations, legal procedures, and the cold patience of people who know exactly when to let justice tighten its grip. In the days that followed, Chicago kept living at its usual pace. Trains still moved through the city. Lake Michigan still flashed silver beneath the afternoon sun. Meetings still took place, contracts were still signed, and beneath that polished surface, a quiet earthquake spread. At Northcrest Hospitality Projects, word of Adrian's detention spread before internal communications even had time to draft a formal notice. People who had once nodded to him in the hallway, who had laughed at his stories during client cocktail hours, now looked at one another differently. They remembered the strange rushed approvals, the times he brushed off questions with the authority of his title, the shadowy business trips, the expensive gifts, the requests for disbursement with no explanation. One by one, the details they had once dismissed as the quirks of a confident executive began revealing their real nature. Not leadership, abuse of power. Marcus Reed worked almost without rest. He and the internal audit team reconciled every transaction, every vendor code, every disbursement, every override. Once the flow of money was pulled into the light, the truth became too brutal for anyone to keep calling it a misunderstanding. Blue Harbor Strategic LLC was only a shell.
The so-called strategic consulting services had never existed beyond their names. The partner trips were private rendezvous. The client hospitality charges were dinners, gifts, and comforts meant for Sienna. Every trail led back to Adrian, and the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that he had not only betrayed his wife, he had betrayed the very system that fed him. At first, Sienna still tried to cling to the old story. She claimed she had only followed Adrian's lead, that she was young, inexperienced, manipulated, promised things she did not fully understand. But banks do not feel sympathy. Digital signatures do not lie. Withdrawals, personal spending, email exchanges, calendar records, and the corporate registration in her own name all stood there like cold witnesses. She was no longer a delicate mistress who could hide behind a pregnancy and a few tears. She was a woman who had received the money, used the money, and stayed complicit in silence. Adrian reacted far more violently. In his first meetings with investigators and attorneys, he tried to preserve his composure, speaking in the tone of a man long accustomed to managing others. He called everything a personal misunderstanding. He said Naomi was using money and influence to get revenge. He claimed he had only signed what business required. But every time he opened his mouth, another document was placed on the table. A transfer, an approval email, an override order, a hotel camera image, one trace, then another, then another. Some people mistake skill at lying for strength, until the truth is arranged into formation. Then the lie is no longer smoke. It becomes only a lonely sound inside a room that is far too bright. And Lorraine Wells, who once believed that enough family pressure would always force Naomi to bow her head, slowly began to understand that justice is not something that can be intimidated over dinner. In the days after the arrest, she still moved from one law office to a relative's home to another phone call, trying to gather money, gather sympathy, rebuild an image in which Adrian had merely stumbled into trouble by mistake. But the upper-class circles she had once bragged about are the cruelest places when it comes to disgrace. People who once smiled and chatted with her began replying more slowly. People who once borrowed the appearance of closeness to the Wells family now avoided mentioning them in public. Scandal does not need to move quickly. It only needs to land in the right place. Naomi watched all of it from a clear distance. She met with Claire regularly, signed papers, read documents, answered what needed answering. She did not go online to defend herself. She did not tell her friends a dramatic version of events. She did not try to turn herself into a public victim. And it was precisely that silence that made many people begin to see the story differently. Before, they had thought Adrian was the face of Northcrest, the polished husband of a discreet businesswoman. Now they were beginning to understand that Naomi had been the one holding the foundation all along. Adrian had only been an expensive layer of paint brushed over his wife's power, and he had lived in that borrowed shine so long that he forgot he was only the surface. The divorce proceedings were so cold, they were almost devoid of drama. The affair was established. The financial abuse was established. The threat he made in front of the police had been recorded. The evidence Claire prepared was too strong. Adrian's side had very little room left to struggle. In a bright, sealed room, Naomi sat across from a set of neatly tabbed folders and listened to the lawyers go over each clause ending a marriage that had already died long before the wedding photo appeared. When asked whether she wanted to add anything, she said only one sentence: "I do not need anything more from that man." It was spoken gently, but it cut cleaner than any curse. A few months later, the first formal conclusions were issued. Adrian was charged as the principal architect of the embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of authority. Sienna was charged as an accomplice who directly benefited from the illegal flow of money and held the intermediary corporate entity in her own name. The insurance policy was not enough to stand alone as a major criminal charge, but it became a heavy shadow over the entire case, making Adrian harder to defend than ever in the eyes of anyone still tempted to sympathize with him. Throughout the process, Naomi appeared in court no more than necessary. She refused to turn her life into a spectacle for other people's curiosity. But everything that needed to be proven, she proved, completely, cleanly, precisely, in a way that could not be twisted. By the time the final judgment was read, Adrian no longer resembled the man in that secret wedding photo. Months of investigation, detention, and collapse had stripped away the glossy false image he once wore so easily. His face had hollowed. The confidence in his eyes was gone, replaced by the gray confusion of someone discovering for the first time that consequences are not things you can charm, manipulate, or threaten into disappearing. Sienna looked no better. The pregnancy that had once been her strongest card could not protect her from the questions, the records, and the cold gaze of people who had no interest in romantic tragedy. They looked only at the money, and the money had already spoken. Lorraine sold her townhouse to pay for her son's lawyers. She sold it quickly, cheaply, bitterly. On the day she handed over the keys, she stood on the porch of her old home for a long time, her wrinkled hand trembling slightly, feeling for the first time what it means to stand outside a door you once believed would belong to you forever. In the end, karma is not loud. It simply makes people swallow the very thing they once forced on others. One late autumn afternoon, Claire placed the final judgment and the official divorce decree in front of Naomi. Outside the office window, the leaves on the Chicago trees had started to turn yellow. The sunlight had thinned, softer now, sadder. Naomi read everything through once. Then she took the pen and signed the final line that required her confirmation. No one applauded. No one congratulated her. There was no music of victory playing anywhere. There was only a deep, clean, strange silence settling over the room, as if after many months of storm, the sea had finally gone still. Naomi looked down at her hand. Her wedding ring was still there, slender and bright, almost innocent. She twisted it off slowly. The metal slipped from her finger with a lightness so gentle it hurt. She placed the ring into a small velvet box Claire had prepared, not to keep as a memory, to bury it properly. When Naomi stood to leave, the city outside had already lit up. She walked toward the door, then paused for the briefest moment. Claire watched her, but did not ask what she was seeing. There are moments when language becomes the most unnecessary thing in the room. Naomi let out a quiet breath. She did not feel triumphant. She did not ache the way she once had. She only felt that she had just closed a very large door. And on the other side of that door, for the first time in many years, was a stretch of life that belonged entirely to her.
Naomi Carter walked out of the law office that early autumn evening without looking back. Wind from the lake swept down the street, carrying the first thin chill of the season, just enough to stir the edge of her coat. One by one, the lights of Chicago came on, soft gold, deep and distant, as if the whole city were opening a different face to her. It was no longer the place where she had once driven through the night, with her heart torn open by a wedding photo. No longer the maze of betrayal, paperwork, investigations, and endless legal meetings. For the first time in a very long while, Naomi was not walking like someone fleeing ruin. She was walking like someone who had made it through. 2 years later, in that same city, Naomi Carter's name was spoken in a very different tone. Not as the wealthy wife betrayed by her husband, not as the quiet businesswoman who had once silently carried the success of a man who did not deserve it, but as the woman who had turned her collapse into shelter for others. That night, the ballroom of a grand riverside hotel blazed beneath crystal chandeliers. Cream silk drapes fell in soft folds. White flowers had been arranged in elegant clusters along the aisle. On the stage, the name of the newly founded organization, Carter Haven Initiative, shone in silver letters against a deep blue backdrop. It was not overly grand, but it was enough for anyone walking in to understand that this was not a social event. It was a declaration. Naomi stood behind the curtain for a few minutes before stepping out. She wore a midnight blue gown, simple at the neckline, beautifully cut, with no need for sequins or embellishment to stand out. Her hair was swept into a low knot, a few soft strands framing her face. Her eyes no longer carried the sharp steel coldness of the days she was fighting, but neither did they hold the easy gentleness that had once made her vulnerable. What remained was a kind of peace with depth in it, the peace of a woman who had seen the worst in others and still chosen not to become cruel. Below the stage, Maya sat in the front row with a tablet in her hand. 2 years earlier, she had been a young assistant stunned by the collapse of the Wells family. Now she was the first operations director of the foundation, more mature, more perceptive, and loyal to Naomi in a way that needed no explanation. In another corner, Claire Donovan was there too, one hand resting on the event program, her face softened in one of the rare moments when it allowed itself to be. Marcus Reed sat near the sponsor section, back straight, his usual restraint replaced by a quiet kind of pride. The host announced Naomi's name. The room rose in applause. Naomi stepped into the light. In that moment, there were people seeing her for the first time who saw only a beautiful, wealthy, striking woman. But those who knew the real story understood far more than that. They were not looking at someone favored by fate. They were looking at someone who had been pushed to the bottom of humiliation, betrayal, and the threat of losing everything. Then had climbed back up by herself, without turning her pain into an excuse to destroy others. Naomi stood at the microphone for a few seconds before speaking. She looked down at the audience. So many different faces. Women trying to hold themselves together, sponsors waiting to listen, lawyers, advisors, business people, and survivors of toxic marriages. Everyone in that room had carried in a private story. Naomi knew that. When she began to speak, her voice was not loud, but it was clear. "There are wounds that do not bleed," she said. "They leave behind doubt in your own worth. They make a woman begin to ask herself whether she was too ambitious, too independent, too distant, or too strong to be loved properly. And that is the most dangerous lie of all." The room went utterly still. Naomi continued, more slowly. "Betrayal can bring us to our knees.
Financial control can make us believe there is nowhere left to go. Deception in marriage can make all the years we once trusted feel meaningless. But I am standing here today to say something else. Painful truth is not what destroys us. What destroys us is the moment we agree to see ourselves through the eyes of the people who hurt us. The stage lights brushed her face, making her eyes glow a little brighter. Not with the shine of tears, with the light of someone who had found herself again after too much had been taken. The Carter Haven Initiative had been created to support women trapped by financial control, manipulation in marriage, betrayal, and forced silence. The foundation would fund legal guidance, temporary housing, financial literacy training, and psychological recovery programs. Naomi did not use her own story as a decorative piece in her speech. She placed it there like a key, something to open the door for other women to walk through. Applause filled the room when she finished, but what made Naomi's heart fall quiet was not the applause. It was the sight of a young woman in the third row, crying in silence, one hand gripping an old handbag in her lap, as though she had just heard someone speak aloud the truth she herself had swallowed for years. After the program, guests began to scatter into smaller groups. The press took photographs. Donors approached the operations team. Maya walked up to Naomi with her tablet still glowing with notes. "Tonight went even better than we expected," she said softly. "Several organizations want to commit to long-term support tonight." Naomi held a cup of hot tea and smiled faintly. "Good. That means we'll be able to help more women." Maya hesitated for a moment, then looked at Naomi as if weighing whether she should say the next thing. "I got a few more updates, too." Naomi tilted her head. "What kind of updates?" Maya lowered her voice. Sienna's latest appeal for a reduced sentence was denied. The board said she still hasn't shown any clear remorse. And Lorraine Wells was evicted from her most recent rental after months of unpaid bills. She's staying with a distant relative now. I heard they treat her more like hired help than family. Naomi did not answer immediately. She turned and looked through the tall window, where the city at night stretched beneath the horizon. The river reflected the lights like a dark ribbon of silk. Farther still was the vast shadow of the lake, where the wind still moved the way it had 2 years ago. Only her heart was different now. She felt no joy hearing it. She felt no pain either, only something neutral, deep, and still. Karma does not need her to stand there and watch every step. It knows how to find its own way. And Adrian, Maya added very quietly, sent another letter to the office, still apologizing, still saying he finally understands what he lost. Naomi lowered her eyes to the cup in her hands. Steam rose from it in thin threads like mist. "Understanding too late changes nothing," she said. Maya nodded. She understood. For many people, victory is the moment the other person falls to their knees and admits they were wrong. But for Naomi, the real victory had come much earlier. It came on the day she no longer needed Adrian's apology to heal. At that moment, one of the event staff approached to say that a woman wanted to see Naomi that very night. She was not on the guest list, but she had been standing outside the hall for nearly half an hour, saying she needed help. Naomi did not hesitate. "Bring her into the small east reception room." The woman was brought in a few minutes later. She was young, wearing an old coat, clutching a wrinkled folder of papers, her eyes full of the shame of someone long accustomed to apologizing for her own wounds. She sat on the edge of the chair, as if afraid she might take up too much space in such a beautiful room. Naomi walked in and sat across from her. She did not bombard her with questions. She did not look at her with pity. The woman took a few seconds before she could speak. "My husband controls all the money. He says I won't survive if I leave.
I don't know where to begin. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she set her tea down on the table. We begin with the truth, she said. Then the documents. Then a safe way out. One step at a time. The woman began to cry, not loudly, just the kind of cry that comes from someone hearing for the first time that there is still a road ahead. Naomi sat there in that warm, softly lit room and understood the final thing that broken marriage had left behind for her. Not bitterness, not obsession, but the ability to recognize when another woman is drowning and to reach out before it is too late. When the night had deepened and most of the guests had gone, Naomi finally left the ballroom. She walked down the long corridor lined with glass panels reflecting her image back at her. She was no longer the Naomi of the lakefront mansion, no longer the Naomi of suffocating dinners and useless restraint. She had lost a husband who betrayed her, but in return she had found her own voice, her own power, and a purpose greater than survival. Behind her, the ballroom doors closed with a soft hush. Ahead of her, an entire city was still waiting for women like her to light lamps in other people's darkness. And that was Naomi Carter's journey. From a wife betrayed, underestimated, and pushed out of her own marriage, she rose, reclaimed the truth, reclaimed her life, and turned her deepest wounds into strength that could save others. Sometimes justice does not arrive like a miracle. It arrives when we are clear-minded enough to face the truth, strong enough not to make ourselves small, and brave enough to keep walking without looking back. If you believe Naomi did the right thing, leave a comment and tell me which moment in her story stayed with you the most. If you have ever witnessed or lived through a betrayal like this, you can share your perspective too, because your story may be the very thing that gives someone else strength. And if you love dramatic stories about betrayal, karma, justice, and the powerful rebirth of a woman who refused to stay broken, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.